So good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the Provost Graduate Student Lecture Series. I'm Chuck Tabor from the Graduate School. We've been doing this series for in our fourth year now, and I have to tell you, it's by far the most fun thing that I've done in the graduate school. And what's great about it is that it just exposes us to the extraordinary quality of our graduate students and the work that they're doing. I'm always so impressed by the quality of the work that the students are doing. It's a little scary, actually, for a guy like me, an old guy. I'm not going to say a lot about this series. I just want you all to be aware that this series, I think, is an important opportunity for you to hear about research that other students are doing, even in fields that are very different from your own. So please keep an eye out, and if anything looks intriguing, come by for a talk. I'll tell you about our next talk, which is by Luisa Escobar-Hoyos from Molecular and Cellular Pharmacology. I'm going to try her title, and I will tell her to simplify it for the talk. But her title as it is right now is Molecular Classification of Cervical Intraepithelial Lesions and Carcinoma. I believe it has to do with cancer. We will see if we can get that simplified for the talk. It's now my pleasure to introduce Lisa Dietrich from the program in Cultural Analysis and Theory, who's going to introduce our speaker today, Rachel Tillman. And very quickly, I have a little something to present to Rachel, Graduate School, as a token of our appreciation for your work.
Wow. Does she have to open it now? No, wait. You're supposed to wait. Thank you, Chuck. It's a great pleasure. I'm very delighted and honored to introduce Rachel Tillman to you today. Okay. Are we in the right place? I don't know. I don't know. No, you're fine. You're fine. You're in good. No, you should stand right there. Okay. Yeah. If I had to choose one word that captures Rachel as student, teacher, thinker, person, it would be that she is ethical. And by that I mean pursuing ways to live well, not for herself, but for others. Rachel is a PhD candidate in philosophy as well as a graduate certificate student in women's and gender studies. And she's the recipient of the Jacob Javits Fellowship Award, which is a highly competitive national award for students of superior academic ability and exceptional promise. And that's Rachel. She has 2 MAs in philosophy and religious studies from the University of Denver, where she wrote her thesis on Protestant epistemologies and doctrines of the fall in American evangelical anti-intellectualism. And I wanted to say that title because I think it's really interesting that she did that work before coming to Stony Brook. And she graduated magna cum laude from University of Denver. Continuing the practice of drawing lines between philosophical discourses and other discourses, Rachel's dissertation project, I don't know if this is still the title, but I'm going to throw it out there, the Ontology of Health. The Ontology of Health asks how we know and do health. Her approach to these questions is informed by the philosophy of Aristotle and Deleuze and Guattari, and the philosophers here know that's an interesting trio to bring together. But also by the interdisciplinary methods developed by feminist science studies scholars, people like Anna Marie Moll, Elizabeth Wilson, and Karen Barad is someone you'll talk about today, I think, a little bit. Her work is invested in addressing the questions of political and social freedom that attend to how we achieve and measure health as individuals and members of population groups. She already has several publications, including most recently, and this is out not in paper yet, but the Hypatia.
Just come out in paper.
It's on the web, though. Most recently, an article in Hypatia entitled Ethical Embodiment and Moral Reasoning, a Challenge to Peter Singer. Yay. Go, Rachel. That's a good way to start your career.
Rachel do.
Oh, you'll find out. Okay, in 2011, Rachel was awarded the Vivian Hartog Memorial Award for Excellence in Teaching for a Women's and Gender Studies graduate certificate student. And I had the pleasure of observing Rachel's class, and I was impressed by the way in which Rachel kind of effortlessly combines a number of different pedagogical practices and fields of knowledge to form an elegantly simple but richly varied educational experience for her students. In other words, she's a damn good teacher. And really, it was kind of impressive. Rachel's generosity extends far beyond the classroom. She is keenly aware of both the difficulty and necessity of creating community in the university. She engages actively with her students, fellow graduate students, teachers, and seeks out advice and mentorship of people across campus and beyond. I feel very lucky to have had Rachel in graduate seminars and also to be working with her on her dissertation, because her passion and brilliance creates a space for intellectual adventure and companionship that is truly invigorating. And I don't say that about just any graduate student, frankly. Rachel is an intellectual, but in the best sense of the word. She is a thinker and scholar who works collaboratively towards a greater good rather than for the narrow satisfactions of a career. And as she herself has said, living and learning are inseparable from each other. Her paper today is called That. I won't read it. It's a long title. Please join me in welcoming Rachel Tillman.
I don't think I need this microphone. Okay.
I think you need it for the recording.
No, we're good. I got one.
Oh, you got
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much, Dr. Tabor, as well. I just want to start by thanking Dr. Tabor and everyone on his team who worked so hard to make this event possible. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here and to be able to share my work with the campus community. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. And I also want to thank the philosophy department and my dissertation committee. Ed Casey is my chair, and Lisa is on my committee, and Stephen Post in the Center for Medical Humanities and Bioethics. And they have been a huge support for me in my growth as a scholar and in my dissertation work, and I'm very grateful to be able to work with them for their mentorship as well. Thanks to Lisa, because I ended up TAing for her my first year, that I ended up being a feminist philosopher and not just a philosopher, I would say, which is a huge part of my work, as you'll see. So thank you. And finally, thank you to all of you for being here, my friends and colleagues and my students and other campus members. I'm really grateful that you're here to enter into dialogue with me. As an Aristotelian, I believe the best ideas come forth in dialogue, and I'm really glad you're here to be part of that process with me today. So my talk today is entitled Chronic Disease and the Conceptual Bases of Western Medicine, How a More Dynamic Concept of Matter Will Help Us to More Effectively Define and Promote Health. So my work starts with a basic question, which is, why do diseases as diverse as autoimmune disorders, digestive syndromes, cancer, chronic back pain, scoliosis, infertility, hormonal imbalances, heart disease, and Alzheimer's, just to name a few, continue to mystify researchers, elude treatment, and generally fail to be helped by mainstream medical interventions? This question is deeply important to me on a personal level. Like many of you, I imagine, unless I'm surrounded by unusually unhealthy people, I personally know people who have struggled with nearly every item on this list. And I have family members who've had cancer multiple times, family members with Alzheimer's, heart disease, high blood pressure, scoliosis, friends with IBS, chronic back pain, infertility, hormonal imbalances, autoimmune disorders. In almost every case, the options given to them by Western medicine have failed to cure them. Not only this, but the treatments that are available often cause many other secondary health problems, often very serious ones. More disturbing, perhaps, is that in all of these cases, Western medicine is at a loss to explain why these things are happening in the first place. We are all familiar with the suffering, frustration, and difficult decisions that people with these illnesses face. The inability of Western medicine to offer them anything better is simply not good enough. Something is wrong. Why is it that Western medicine cannot find better solutions to these problems? So that's the problem driving my work. I study philosophy because I believe philosophical ideas shape the way we act and interact in the world. And philosophical ideas have a very powerful impact on our everyday lives. If you've been in my Philosophy 100 class, as some of you were, you know that that's a big framework for why we study philosophy at all. My dissertation focuses on the philosophical ideas that shape the dominant paradigm of medicine in the West, otherwise known as allopathic or biomedical medicine. And there's various ways to group medical kind of frameworks, and I'm just going to kind of lump those all together. If you are familiar with so-called alternative or holistic approaches to health, you know that they offer very valuable critiques of Western medicine. While these critiques are interesting and informative and important, in my work and in this talk, I focus on only one theoretical problem that I believe is at the heart of Western medicine's approach to the body and to health. And just as a pause before I go on, ironically enough, I'm talking about health, and I came down with a pretty bad cold this weekend, which you can probably tell. So if I feel better than I sound, but if you can't hear me because my voice is a little scratchy, please let me know. So the theoretical problem is that Western medicine conceives of the matter of the body as primarily mechanistic in nature. And so the preliminary argument of my dissertation is that the matter of the body is not primarily mechanistic in nature. And until we start understanding bodily matter in a more dynamic way, these problems that bodies develop will continue to mystify us. That's my contention. The greatest task facing Western medicine today is to find ways to understand the dynamism of bodily matter. So just to give you an overview of today's talk, today I will explain more about how mechanistic thinking permeates Western medicine, the problems that this creates, and why I think we need to think matter more dynamically. Then I will take some insights from the work of several feminist thinkers to show two examples of how to think matter more dynamically. Then I will conclude by suggesting some epistemological, political, and clinical implications of the theoretical shift that I'm advocating. All right. So the ways we define health and disease necessarily involve material dimensions because the body is, at least in part, material. When we define health and disease, we rely implicitly or explicitly on philosophical assumptions about the basic nature of matter itself. Western thought has, since the time of Descartes and Newton, if not before, understood matter to be basically and primarily mechanistic in nature. Despite many advances in science that question this basic assumption, the mechanistic understanding of matter continues to dominate Western medicine and implicitly shapes its ability to understand bodily health and disease. So, talking about the mechanistic understanding of matter. A mechanistic account of bodies assumes that bodies as wholes are nothing more than the sum of their parts. Just as the material world around us, our environment, is still largely understood in mechanistic terms, as brute material open to rearrangement at whim, so do we think of the materiality of bodies in primarily mechanistic ways. There are two main components to this conception of matter. First, matter is passive and inert. Because of the legacy of the mechanistic worldview, we have long believed that matter acts according to universal and timeless laws. In this view, matter is passive in the sense that any change or dynamism must be given to it from without. This passivity is one of the main characteristics of the neo-Cartesian notion of matter, which is still the dominant conception at work in Western medical practice and theory. The second element of the mechanistic conception of matter that governs Western medicine is that matter is separable. Just as atoms are classically understood to be isolable entities, so body parts are essentially separable, disparate units. Hearts and lungs and arteries and livers and uteruses are all separable parts that can be manipulated in isolation from other parts. The assumption that a body is simply a sum of its parts renders the mechanistic approach the primary and often the only course for intervention. So, medical intervention. Okay, channeling Senator Ruby. Okay. This is not always problematic. In some cases, mechanistic interventions are obvious and effective solutions. Doctors routinely replace hips and knees in older patients because these parts of the body have important mechanical aspects and are prone to wearing out, just like any other mechanical part. But the same approach guides intervention into other, more chronic conditions. For example, when we discover cancerous breast cells, we cut them out, or we kill them with radiation or chemotherapy. If we find plaque in someone's veins, we scrape it out. If your blood pressure is high, we thin your blood. If If your uterus prolapses, we cut it out or we put nets in your body to hold it in place. If your back is inexplicably curved, we attach it to metal rods and screws and fuse it together so it becomes straight. You have Crohn's disease and your gut is causing you to have autoimmune reactions in your gut. We cut out the offending part of your intestine. These are all stories from people I know, okay? Not only is mechanism the main framework for medical intervention, but it also governs the way we, so this is a bit of a transition. So not only is mechanism the main framework for medical intervention, but it also governs the way we define health and disease themselves. So to be broad, I would say that there are two general approaches to defining health and disease. The first is what I kind of generally label the objective approach. And this is probably the dominant and common sense view. It generally permeates the biomedical field. Objective approaches to health take as their starting point that definitions of health are mind independent and objective. Scientific realism is perhaps the best known version of the objective approach. Scientific realism is a philosophical position about the existence of matter. It assumes that matter or materiality is real and exists external to and independent of mind. It's anti-idealist, therefore. When applied to health, the objective or scientific realist approach has some significant weaknesses, since it cannot account very well for subjective and social influences on both definitions of health and health itself. It also tends to assume that definitions of health are universal and timeless, and thus has a difficult time explaining individual differences, sexual differences between male and female bodies or other kinds of bodies, as well as historical variations. And of course, there exists an opposing approach to health, which is the subjective. It begins from the opposite premise. It argues that definitions of wellness and illness are subjectively defined. What is healthy and what is sick are defined by the human mind, whether in concert within a society or by the individual themselves, his or herself, or whatever. Social constructivism is probably the main version of what I label broadly as a subjective approach to health. I first started to wrestle with this view during a seminar I took with Lisa in the spring of 2009. The course was called Madness and Civilization, 1960 to 1980. Over the course of the semester, we studied a variety of philosophical approaches to mental illness, all written during the time period in question. This was particularly interesting to me since my grandfather was diagnosed and treated for schizophrenia in the 60s and 70s and was in and out of institutions for the rest of his adult life. He was a young man at that time. The seminar was named after a book by Michel Foucault in which he uses historical analysis to suggest that mentally ill is a label that society uses to exclude, marginalize, or control those who do not accept or live by its norms. I'm sure Lisa might have something to say about this. This is much of what she works on. But this basic approach to understanding the concepts of illness and health has been further developed by many other feminist and post-structuralist thinkers, and is by now a fairly well-known method for critiquing the biomedical understanding of many mental illnesses, including depression and schizophrenia. In their book Anti-Oedipus, French philosophers Gilles Deleuze and clinician Félix Guattari actually celebrate schizophrenia as a metaphor for the process of escaping the confines of the all-encompassing capitalist machine that is modern society. Needless to say, I was very curious to see how these scholarly accounts fit with my family's experiences. And for my research project, I interviewed my mother and my grandmother about their experiences with my grandfather and about the medical treatments and stigmas of that era. There was quite a disparity between my family's experience and the social constructivist account of his illness. I concluded that there are certainly lots of merits to the social constructivist approach, since health and disease have important subjective components and social components. But I also think this approach has a significant weakness in that it cannot account very well for an objective aspect to the problem. An illness in any understandable sense involves some kind of harm, and the social constructivist approach leaves space only for subjective harm caused by stigma and censure, and not objective harm caused by the condition itself. So, interestingly, whoops. All right, we'll just skip through these. All right, both of these views rely implicitly on a mechanistic understanding of matter. And although they seem to be diametrically opposed, they really share the same basic framework. In particular, they both conceive of matter as being inert, passive, and without agency. One evidence of this is that both realist and constructivist views of health assume that natural, biological, or objective definitions of health are necessarily universal and unchanging. The social constructivist view, therefore, in reaction to that, implicitly agrees with this and assumes that the resources for creation, change, and transformation must exist in the cultural or social arenas rather than in the biological or the natural. Critiques of objective definitions of health must reject, therefore, what is biological or natural and insist that these definitions are entirely socially, culturally constructed. This view, more or less until recently, has permeated feminist thought and other forms of post-structuralist thought, including psychoanalysis. So it turns out that thinking matter is inert causes a whole host of problems. And I work a lot on Aristotle, as most of you know, and I really love his word impasse, which of course means basically unsolvable problem. So here are some impasses created by thinking matter mechanistically as they show up in our dominant ways of thinking about health and medicine. Let's start with the impasses of the scientific realist approach to health. Because the objectivity of scientific realism depends on matter not only being inert, but external to mind, it has a serious problem explaining how we can actually know the material world if it is completely external to us. So externality is a relation of otherness that allows for a divide to arise between the knowing subject and the material objects of knowledge. This gap in theory assures the possibility of objectivity, yet it also creates an impasse in that there's no connection between the knower and the known, so that could enable these processes of knowledge to take place. This gap is not only a problem for philosophy and science, but also for medicine. A scientific realist account of health cannot explain whether or how mind and body are related. The placebo effect and psychosomatic conditions are just two obvious examples of mind-body connections that Western medicine really fails to explain. All right. Social constructivism also has an impasse related to the mechanistic conception of matter. Social constructivism, especially in its feminist and post-structuralist forms, struggles with a deep political impotence as a result of its belief that matter and materiality can offer nothing to the quest for social transformation. Matter and biology themselves have no agential force or dynamism, which means there is no way that an individual or individuals can resist the discursive and constitutive power of society on their bodily lives. Society determines all. This is just a theoretical problem. You kind of have to distill the ideas to get to this. When it comes to defining health, the social constructivist view shares the same danger of making human minds the total determinant of reality. But as the growing field of environmental medicine shows, this is simply just not empirically accurate. There is much about our bodily situation that none of us can choose or determine. There are limits and consequences to our bodily engagements and interactions in the world that have direct relationships with our ability to thrive or with health. Put simply, we cannot and do not fully define what is healthy for us at will. Not even societies have this power. There's an important material component. All right, so there's a deep, irresolvable divide in our thinking between subjective and objective accounts of health. This leads to irreconcilable differences in how we frame, narrate, and make policies about health. We have an impasse about how to understand what health actually is and who gets to define it. I will speak more about the political impasse later. But in Western medicine, perhaps the most important impasses are clinical. This is what I started the talk with today. We have a deeply reductive understanding of the nature of the matter of our bodies. We think about every bodily problem as if it were essentially mechanical in nature. All our solutions are oriented by mechanistic thinking toward mechanistic interventions. Yet all of the chronic conditions I highlighted at the beginning of this talk all of the chronic conditions I highlighted present a huge challenge to Western medicine. These are among a whole host of other chronic conditions that I didn't list that are continuing to fail to be addressed and prevented by the mechanistic approach. Mechanistic solutions remove the immediate and visible cause of the problem, but they do not prevent that cause from recurring in the first place, and they often do not even understand why it developed. The reason Western medicine fails to find or even look for ultimate causes is that mechanistic accounts do not offer the theoretical resources for understanding the complex, multi-system, long-term causality of living bodies. On the contrary, this mechanistic orientation often prevents us from looking far enough and wide enough and long enough to even begin to ask the right questions. In this sense, the mechanistic understanding of matter actually prevents Western medicine from understanding these conditions. How often do you find medical practitioners trying to understand why you got cancer, why there are plaques in your heart, why your uterus prolapsed, why your bowel is irritable, why your back curved, so as to prevent your body from developing these problems again in the future? And just a tiny little anecdote, my husband has had a deviated septum for most of his life. His little bone in his nose is bent. He had surgery to fix it, and he recently broke his nose, and when they took the x-rays, it had moved back. And so what are their options? Have another surgery to move it back, but his doctor said, these bones have memory. So it's like, well, we can keep putting it into place, but we don't know why it keeps wanting to go over there, you know? It's like, why? It's so not helpful. All right. So more often than not, these questions are not even raised in clinical practice. And even when they are, there is rarely a satisfactory answer. This is highly problematic. Furthermore, not only do mechanistic solutions fail to address the ultimate cause and thus fail to prevent it from reoccurring, but they also fail to address and care for the deep interconnections between various parts of the body, which means that they themselves, these medical interventions, are often the cause of subsequent, very often serious health problems that can be life-threatening or even fatal in certain cases. All right, so I see these problems as arising directly out of a theoretical misconception about the nature of matter. There's a fundamental flaw in the assumption that bodies are primarily mechanistic in nature. Mechanism simply cannot fully explain all of what happens in a living body. Matter, and especially the matter of living bodies, is not inert. Living matter is dynamic. In living beings, living matter is constantly growing, developing, changing, and moving. In order to really understand health and illness, we need to be able to think the material aspect of bodies in a more dynamic way. As I will show, both the scientific realist and the social constructivist approaches to health ultimately fail to provide us with robust definitions of health, exactly because they fail to have a dynamic concept of matter. It is also becoming increasingly clear that these chronic conditions cannot be explained using the mechanistic account. So, just to kind of put a little fine point on my claim, the matter of living bodies is characterized most thoroughly not by its mechanism, but by its dynamism. So I'm not claiming that mechanism isn't true of living bodies. I think that it's not that they're non-mechanical, that's part of the picture of how living bodies operate, but it's been our primary means of conceptualizing bodies for a long time, and that has been because it works, and it works to some extent, and it works in some cases, but it can't fully account for the whole picture. And I'm searching for a good example for this idea, but I think that I tried this one out on my husband, so you can tell me what you think of this. But so if you're in a nursery and you have a pile of wooden blocks and a baby, mechanism is a pretty good explanatory device for the pile of blocks. I mean, it doesn't actually do justice to everything that's happening in the matter of that wood that's been removed from the tree and made to shape. Like, it is decomposing, and mechanism isn't really like going to tell us a lot about that necessarily. But the baby, like, if you just think of baby as the block, as you do the blocks, you're not going to get very far with the baby, right? Like, yeah, you could take it apart into pieces and move it around. That's true of it. But like, that's not going to tell you anything about its developing motor skills, about cognition, about respiration, about nutrition, about like elimination. I mean, all these processes that are happening in the baby, like growth, I mean, and those things are happening in all living matter. It's just that baby is a good example because they're like really concentrated in that case and small. Okay, so I'm convinced that the assumption that bodies are mechanical all the way down is never going to be a satisfactory path for understanding the living body. Instead, we need to look at how bodies act in ways that exceed or transcend mechanism. The growth, development, and dynamic interactive functioning that are constantly at work in living bodies are more than the sum of mechanistic interactions. To fully understand what health is for living bodies, we need an account of bodily materiality that can fully engage with its dynamism. In recent years, philosophers and theorists have been explicitly challenging the dominant mechanistic conceptions of matter, such as Cartesian dualism, representationalism, scientific realism, seeking to put forth newer and more dynamic theories of materiality. Today, I want to show the implications of this re-theorizing of matter on Western medicine, including the ways that we define health and disease and the ways that we conceptualize and treat these conditions. So, how can we begin to think living matter in more dynamic ways? Give my matter some water so it can keep functioning. All right, this may seem like a somewhat abstract theoretical task, but since basic presuppositions about matter are at the heart of our frameworks for understanding and treating disease, reconceptualizing matter actually has important practical and clinical implications. That is the starting point for my research, in which I use the resources of Western philosophy, including Aristotle and Deleuze and other feminist theory, to put forth a more dynamic conception of matter. To give you an idea of what is involved in this task, I want to look briefly today at two thinkers who have begun to try to understand matter as dynamic. Many of the thinkers who are contributing to this kind of wave are feminists, for a reason that I will explain in just a moment. I find their work very helpful, not only because it gives us some examples of the kinds of questions we can raise to help think matter differently, but also because it indicates what this reconceptualization of matter can do for helping us to solve some long-standing theoretical problems, including all of the impasses that we just discussed. So the problem of how to understand matter has long interested feminists. This is because in much of Western thought, women have historically been understood to be somehow closer to matter than men. This assimilation of women to matter has had malicious political and ethical effects. Identifying women with matter has most often served to denigrate them as the more passive sex, or as an explanation for why their subservient roles are fixed in nature and cannot be changed. In both cases, the nature of matter itself has been a real and concrete problem for women. They have suffered in their very existence the consequences of assuming that matter is passive and inert. This has created, obviously, a strong motivation for feminists to investigate the nature of this matter. Yet it is only recently that feminists have begun to question the notion of matter as passive and inert. One reason that this issue did not receive attention sooner is that much of feminist theory took as its starting point the traditional opposition between matter as passive and culture as active. So the idea that nature or matter is fixed served as a starting point for women to fight back against essentialist and deterministic claims about women's inferior abilities, natures, and roles in society. But rather than trouble the terms of the debate, they accepted them. Matter, and therefore nature, was fixed, which meant that these were essentializing and oppressive notions in themselves. There's a few exceptions to this general trend I'm describing, but not many. A few people embraced the idea that matter is passive, and we can celebrate that. But most people tried to distance themselves from what they saw as an oppressive notion of matter. So then the only possibility for escaping deterministic claims about women's natural place, role, and abilities was to argue that these were not natural but cultural. This anti-essentialist idea has gotten a lot of traction and has definitely been a strong tool in the feminist toolbox. One familiar example is the by now dogmatically asserted opposition between sex and gender. Sex is the biological or fixed aspect of bodily life, and gender is the social or cultural aspect. We learned about this in Women's Studies 103. But this is actually just another example of the same opposition between matter as passive and culture as active that we saw at work in scientific realism and social constructivism. So fortunately, there are some contemporary feminist theorists and scientists who are working on putting forward a new, more dynamic understanding of matter that undermines this traditional dualistic opposition. Today, I will briefly highlight a few key ideas from the work of two such thinkers, Karen Barad and Elizabeth Wilson. Barad and Wilson are major figures in a movement broadly labeled Feminist Materialism that begins by challenging the two important presuppositions of the mechanistic view of matter. So the first is that matter is independent and separable, and the second is that matter is passive and inert. First, let's talk about the separability of matter. Feminist materialists demonstrate that we cannot separate matter from mind or from other matter as if matter were an isolable, independently existing entity. They place particular emphasis on the connections between mind and matter. While feminist materialists affirm, along with scientific realists, that physical reality is not fully dependent on thought, so they're both anti-idealist in that sense, they highlight the dynamic relationship between the two. Feminist materialists show how matter and mind, including will, intention, intellect, and social and cultural forces, are related and interact in dynamic ways. Not only does thought influence material development, but materiality also influences and shapes mind. An obvious corollary of this interactivity, then, is that matter is dynamic and has its own kind of agency. The relationality and dynamism of matter are intimately related to one another, and they're both essential for understanding the world around us and our own material bodies and how they work. So this is Karen Barad. She received her PhD in theoretical particle physics right here at Stony Brook. Just learned that this week. She now teaches at UC Santa Cruz in the Feminist Studies Department and is affiliated with the History of Consciousness and the Philosophy Department as well. Her philosophical book on physics, Meeting the Universe Halfway, provides an excellent and fascinating example of an empirically grounded theoretical account of the dynamism and agency of matter. So Barad implicates the implications of Niels Bohr's philosophy of quantum physics, while Bohr focused largely on the epistemological or knowledge-related implications of quantum physics. Barad develops the ontological implications, or what quantum physics can tell us about the nature of reality itself. Barad puts forth a view that she calls agential realism. Her view is like scientific realism in the sense that it accounts for a real material world. But unlike scientific realism, agential realism does not posit matter that is inert and exists separately from mind. Instead, Barad demonstrates that matter has agency and is interconnected with human knowers, shaped by them and shaping them as well. So I'm going to really briefly show you how she talks about this. So she demonstrates this by looking closely at some lessons from quantum physics about the entanglement not only of material particles with one another, which a lot of us have heard about probably, but also with the matter that scientists study with scientific concepts, methods, and laboratory practices. One of the main issues in quantum physics that preoccupied Bohr was the wave-particle paradox that developed in the late 19th century. This refers to the idea that light and other kinds of matter behaves both like particles and waves. Hence my nice. The paradox comes in trying to decide which they definitively are, or ontologically are. So thought experiments by Einstein and Bohr about whether electrons were waves or particles were empirically tested in the 1990s when Young developed an experimental way to determinately capture the behavior of electrons in what is called a two-slit or a double-slit apparatus. And just for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of give you, this is a little joke slide. Just to keep things a little bit light. All right. So when you shoot electrons through this device, even one at a time, they create an interference pattern, which indicates that they're behaving as waves. But, and scientists are very clever, and they found a way to measure which electron went through which slit. It's called a witch-slit experiment. Suddenly, the interference pattern disappears. So it appears that the apparatus in question actually changes the behavior of the electrons. So this obviously calls into the question the idea that the world is populated with individual things with their own independent sets of properties that exist prior to measurement. So according to Barad, the lesson we should take from quantum physics, is that matter doesn't come in discrete, separately existing predeterminate bundles. Instead, within particular interactions, certain properties become determinate while others are specifically excluded. This is Bohr's principle of complementarity. So this means that the material arrangements of experimental situations are an important and constitutive component of the physical reality that they measure. Indeed, as Barad argues, the actual nature of the material world is constitutively underdetermined, so the nature of a phenomenon that we're studying becomes determinate only within a particular context of engagement. So in her reading of quantum physics, laboratory experiments designed to measure matter itself as a separate entity actually show that matter and mind, ideas, concepts, social, scientific practices, etc., are actually deeply interrelated ontologically. In fact, they are all part of the same reality. So we are only able to distinguish the material objects of our study by making intentional divisions in the world, whether through experimental or other kinds of apparatuses. This might sound like we are floating towards a social constructivist kind of view where we determine what reality is going to be for us. And according to Broad, this is not the case, and objectivity is preserved because these cuts that we make by having this apparatus versus the other one are reproducible and communicable. So those are the conditions for objectivity, and that's what she thinks Bohr thought as well. But not only this, but the measurements also have a definite meaning because matter and material agency also contribute to how reality comes to be configured and perceived. The shape, size, weight, and availability of materials, the behavior of the matter we are studying, like these electrons, other contingent material conditions, all actively shape the world that we live in and that we study. In fact, the role of matter is so significant that Broad labels the relationship between humans and other agents and material reality as being one of intra-action instead of interaction, which emphasizes the fact that these entities emerge as they interact with each other rather than pre-existing, which is what she thinks is implied by interaction. So this view emphasizes the agentic nature of matter. On this account, matter is not separate or inert. It's dynamically engaged with us, just as we are engaged with it. And we also are it in very important ways. So I'm going to demonstrate this a little further by talking about, we've already talked about all of this, by talking a little bit about the work of Elizabeth Wilson, who is another feminist scientist. She has a PhD in psychology from the University of Sydney and now works as a professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Emory University. Her research joins biology, psychoanalysis, and evolutionary theory. Her main contribution to feminist materialism is to show the way that feminism has turned away from bodily matter and to argue that it can be reinvigorated by paying more attention to biology, basically. So she argues that feminism and psychoanalysis, like social constructivism, assume that the active power for transformation, both positive and negative, come from non-biological rather than biological forces, non-material rather than material forces. This is true even when feminism is directly focused on questions of the body. So the body may be culturally or discursively shaped or determined, inscribed, politicized, performed, but the biological body itself is simply a passive recipient of all of these activities. Wilson aims to bring biology and its active contributions back into the critical endeavor. I find her work inspiring because she raises provocative questions about the actual dynamism and activity of matter in various psychological, neurological conditions. So it's starting to align a little more with questions of health. In her book, Psychosomatic, she analyzes the way that hysterical patients have bodily material transformations that are understood to be caused by what are classified as mental or non-somatic, non-bodily causes. So she looked at the case of a patient of Freud's who could see in black and white upon hearing the click of a camera. While many, including Freud himself, have been more interested in the psychological factors at play in this condition, Wilson focuses on the material mechanisms by which this condition comes about. This leads her to raise questions that have not often been raised, either in feminist commentaries or in the history of medicine. So, and I quote, because she's very eloquent when she says these kinds of things, "What kind of biological material, retina, optic nerve, visual cortex, stops processing color under the sway of a photographic seduction? Surely one of the most curious things about this symptom is that the nervous system is able to function according to scenes, acts, tableaus, and intermissions, to perform on cue and on schedule with the click of a camera." So through attention to the biological detail of this condition, she highlights the dynamic and agential nature of the matter of the body. Although traditionally, psychosomatic conditions have been cited as an example of how the mind influences the body, Wilson demonstrates that there are incredibly dynamic material processes at work that also merit interest and research. Rather than ignoring or repudiating the biological substrate as uninteresting or uninformative, as many feminists and Freud himself have done, Wilson argues that we can learn a lot about the flexible and dynamic nature of matter by paying attention to how the biology of the body transforms itself in conversions. Furthermore, hysteric conversions bring to central stage the complexity of the dynamic relationship between mind and body. She shows this even more so perhaps in another case where the pattern of influence operates really obviously both from mind to body and from body to mind. And in her article, Gut Feminism, Wilson discusses bulimia as one such condition. For Wilson, one of the most interesting features of bulimia is that it has a high correlation with depression and can be treated by the use of antidepressants. She raises a key question about these accepted facts. What explains this correlation? While the clinical literature on the subject is split in a neat line between those arguing for psychological causation, these drugs influence the mind and then you get better, and those arguing for organic or flat biological, these drugs influence appetite and then you get better, Wilson argues that the clinical data actually demonstrate a much more complex causality. According to Wilson, about 95% of the body's serotonin exists in the neural networks in the gut, which means that serotogenic treatments have effects on mood, not just by going through the brain, but by directly influencing the workings of the gut. This means we can logically expand our understanding of the gut's activities to include not only digestion, but also rumination and even depression. This is not simply that mood and biology are connected, but that the two have a kind of co-constitutive relationship where neither can be thought separately from the other. Wilson argues that the biological bodily processes of bulimia, their connection to mental states, and the fact that they can be treated using medicines designed to target mood disorders can only be explained using a model that adequately accounts for the reciprocal dynamic relationship of causality between mind and matter. We need to conceive of the mood-related aspects of bulimia as being originally embodied in the gut itself. And I have a really beautiful extended quote, but just for reasons of time, I'm going to skip it. So here's the split, and here's her beautiful quote. All right. So one of her main preoccupations is to complexify the widespread understanding of biology as being inflexible and rigid that dominates psychoanalysis, feminism, other social constructivist approaches. Her work on the connection between gut and psyche, I think, really exemplifies this. To adequately understand how the matter of the body can be so flexible and exist in a relationship of mutual influence with psychological states of minds and moods, we need a theory of matter that is much more dynamic. Wilson's work both argues for and demonstrates the transformative power that attention to biology can have for medical theory and practice. Dynamic biology. Showing that psychosomatic conditions have dual causation, both material and psychological, but that these aren't just two separate things that interact, but they actively constitute each other, opens up new ways of understanding the etiology of illness and also new avenues for treatment. So I will now conclude by highlighting a few social, political, and clinical implications of the shift that I am advocating to a more dynamic conception of matter of the sort that Barad and Wilson exemplify. So this is a conclusion. You guys are hanging in there great. This is a long talk. Thank you for your attention. All right, so solutions to the impasses. Beyond opening up some promising possibilities for thinking matter dynamically, I find Barad and Wilson's work useful because it shows that a more dynamic understanding of materiality addresses a host of previously intractable problems, both theoretical and practical. First, by paying attention to the agency and activity of matter, these thinkers solve the epistemological impasse of scientific realism by explaining how matter and mind are connected. Both Barad and Wilson demonstrate a deep inherent connection and an active reciprocal relationship between mind and matter, nature and culture. This theoretical shift is crucial for medicine in forging a better understanding of the complex ways that mind and body relate. We cannot define health without understanding how these two realms relate. I guess that's it for that side. Okay, more dynamic, interrelated concept of matter can help us move towards a better understanding of the placebo effect, psychosomatic illnesses, but then also a host of other seemingly non-psychological or non-psychosomatic conditions. Furthermore, a dynamic understanding of the agency of matter, like the one put forth by Barad and Wilson, helps us to combat the tendency in social constructivism to assume that non-material forces determine everything, not only our practices and our beliefs, but also our bodies themselves. A more dynamic and agential concept of matter is a powerful antidote to this all-encompassing agency that social forces are often understood to enact, and has very significant implications for the task of defining health. Even when we recognize the subjective influence of culture, psyche, and society on the concept of health and on bodies themselves, an acknowledgement of the agency of matter means that culture and society cannot and do not fully determine what health is for living bodies. Matter is also a significant factor of influence that needs to be adequately addressed and understood. Third, thinking matter dynamically provides a way out of the impasse that has arisen between the objective view of health based on a scientific realist approach and the subjective or constructivist view of health. This is a bioethical and theoretical debate that has deep policy implications. Who defines health and how? A more dynamic conception of matter will help give us resources to think about health as both objective and subjective, both universal and singular. Proper attention to matter stabilizes questions of health in a testable, empirically verifiable realm, while still leaving space for individual differences and psychocultural influences. This conceptual shift will enliven political debates about health and give us tools to talk about the important roles that universal values and individual and cultural differences play in making medicine and healthcare just and effective for all. So there's the political impact, but then there's also the clinical impact. The theoretical shift from a mechanistic to a more dynamic understanding of materiality has important clinical implications for the theory and practice of Western medicine. In light of the rapidly growing epidemics of chronic illness in Western societies, we desperately need ways to understand how the matter of the body dynamically interacts within the body itself and with forces outside of the body, including environmental, psychological, and cultural forces. Many chronic conditions show evidence of this multiple and reciprocal causality, and we need to be able to adequately theorize these complex relations in the living matter of bodies. Decentering the mechanistic account of matter will help us to expand our view of what happens in bodies so that we can start to highlight and investigate a broader and more temporally dispersed set of causal relations. Combined with a more relational ontology of matter, an understanding of matter's dynamism will help us to adequately theorize the relationship of human bodies to their environments and to integrate environmental and nutritional medicine more thoroughly into the overall field of Western medical theory and practice, or research and practice. Rather than monitoring cells until they turn cancerous and then mechanically removing them, when we finally understand matter's dynamism and relationality, we will be more likely to be able to begin to understand why they turn cancerous and how the body's own healing response can be enhanced to prevent them from proliferating. We can begin to look at the complex ways that subtle levels of nutrition influence cellular development so as to promote disease or health in the heart and other related body systems. A more dynamic concept of bodily structure and function will help us begin to think about why the bones of the body start to curve in unbalanced ways, or why internal organs like the uterus might shift from their normal places, and what can be done to help the body readjust itself back into a balance that works for it. It can help us to understand the complex logic and patterns of the body's autoimmune response, the development of plaques in the heart or the brain. Our chances of getting to the root of these conditions will be much improved if we modify the brute mechanistic understanding of matter that governs medical practice and theory, and really think rigorously and systematically about the complex relationality and agency of the matter of our bodies. Matter's constant activity, its dynamism, is at the heart of health, and only by paying proper attention to it will we be able to develop robust and effective understanding of what health is for living bodies. Thank you very much.